So we're in chapter 15, section 4 now, and we're talking about the rising sectional differences. One of the big cases back then would be called the Dred Scott case. Very important that this case, I think of Dred Scott, it would be a case that was very dreaded, that's for sure. So when you think of Dred Scott, you think, oh dear. Well, anyway, the Dred Scott case was an important Supreme Court decision that made things a lot worse. In 1830, there was a slave, and his name was Dred Scott here, and he was taken by his Missouri's a slave state, to the free state of Illinois. So his owner had taken him to Illinois and then on to the free state of Wisconsin. But what happened when they were in the north? His owner died. And so in 1846, Dred Scott sued for his freedom because now he lived in a free state and he felt that he should be a free man, right? His owner had died. So this would go to the Supreme Court. This would be very important, a very important decision in the Supreme Court. It was called Dred Scott versus Sanford. We see this picture here, Dred Scott versus Sanford. Well, the Supreme Court then, they ruled 7-2. The justice at this time was Roger Taney. They ruled, this was their ruling, that Dred Scott was still a slave under the Constitution, meaning he didn't have rights. Number one, a slave was not a citizen, and a slave could not sue in the courts. They're saying basically Dred Scott was not really allowed to sue anyway. And then they said a slave was a property of his owner, and Congress had no right to deprive a citizen of his property. Ugh, gag me with a spoon, right? This basically negated the Missouri Compromise, barring slavery at the 3630 latitude, making it unconstitutional. So basically, remember, Missouri Compromise said that slavery could not be above the latitude of 3630. Well, guess what? Dred Scott lived in the north. And now they were saying that Dred Scott would have to go back to the south and be property of the family of the slave owner, right? So basically, the Dred Scott case said that Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. So now slavery could actually exist any place in the north or anywhere, which of course would really get everyone on fire in the north, thinking that their states could end up being really slave states, and slave owners could come to and have their slaves and settle in the north. So this was a terrible decision. In the meantime, we have the Lincoln and Douglas debates going on. Stephen Douglas was challenged in 1850. Both of them were from Illinois, right? And Stephen Douglas, he was that promoter of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and he was up for re-election. Remember the Kansas Act? He basically said popular sovereignty, that the states could decide on their own. Well, Lincoln the Republican, was chosen for the Republican. Of course, Stephen Douglas was a Democrat. And so in Illinois, the Republicans chose Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln lived 1809 to 1865. Lincoln was very much of a character coming from being raised in the Kentucky wilderness in the West and in Indiana. So he wasn't raised in the political realm of the East. And he was very familiar with hardships and poverty. You can investigate Abraham Lincoln's life. He was self-educated, a very hard worker, and he was admitted to the bar and had a big reputation now as a very good lawyer. He had been a Whig candidate for 4 terms in the state legislature, although he actually lost a lot of those to others, but he did have 4 terms in the state legislature and 1 term in the House. So he was well liked, and he was known for his intelligence and his honesty and, of course, his humor. And he challenged this great orator, this great debater, Stephen Douglas. So Abraham Lincoln being mainly of kind of an unknown person, now was challenging one of the greatest politicians in history. Here's a picture of them. You can see here's Abraham Lincoln. He was a tall guy, and of course Stephen Douglas was short. So they kind of had, they stood next to each other. It was kind of comical, as one was so tall, one was so short. But anyway, so here we have the Douglas, Lincoln and Douglas debates going on in Illinois. During these debates, Lincoln was gaining a lot of supporters, especially he was representing the Republican Party, which was anti-slavery. Douglas was recognized for his eloquent speeches, and he had these broad arguments and compromising and sweeping gestures, and everyone knew Stephen Douglas. And Lincoln was a little bit awkward, and he was a little bit ill at ease in front of the audience, and he didn't use gestures at all when he spoke. And his speech was slow and deliberate, and his voice was kind of high-pitched, unlike Stephen Douglas, who was a great speaker. So, but Lincoln's sincerity came across very clearly as he spoke. People saw that Lincoln was sincere. And he had a knack for making these issues that seemed so complicated very clear to the Republic. So basically are very clear to the citizens of the United States, not just the Republicans, but very clear to people. So when he talked, people understood Abraham Lincoln better than they understood Stephen Douglas. The Freeport Doctrine. Okay, this Lincoln was trying to say popular sovereignty is not going to work in the states. You can't just say the people can decide, because we're going to have big wars like Kansas, right? And so basically he was looking at this Freeport Doctrine was where the extension of slavery would be a major issue in these debates. Isn't this kind of like this picture of Douglas and Lincoln, the short guy and the tall guy there? They're fighting away in the Freeport. Well, anyway, the Freeport Doctrine was called the Freeport Doctrine because the debate was in Freeport, Illinois. And so Lincoln gave Douglas a very damaging blow in this whole thing. He actually, they wouldn't say it back when, but Lincoln won the debate. Lincoln stood firmly against the spread of slavery anywhere it already did not exist. He said, we're not going to bring slavery anyplace. We're actually going to drastically try to get rid of slavery gradually. And so Douglas thought popular sovereignty was fair. He thought, well, then let the people decide in those territories, those states. Well, they saw how Kansas even had an illegal election and stuff, right? Well, Lincoln asked Douglas in the light of the Dred Scott decision. So the Dred Scott decision happened, which Lincoln, of course, and all of the Republicans hated the Dred Scott decision. He said whether people could exclude slavery in their territory before statehood. Basically, okay, then the people could actually say, we don't want slavery at all. And so Douglas would have to then say, deny popular sovereignty or deny the Dred Scott decision. So he would have to say, okay, yes, let's just have popular sovereignty and we'll just forget about the Dred Scott decision, he'd say. And this was pretty confusing because he was actually denying the authority of the Supreme Court. So in doing this and saying popular sovereignty is okay, he was saying that the Supreme Court decision was not good and we should just not even follow the Supreme Court. So that was the discrepancy. So he was walking on a tightrope line, in his trying to describe how the United States should put popular sovereignty, even to the point of denying the Supreme Court. And so Douglas actually attempted to avoid the conflict, saying that people could avoid the decision. So, and refuse police agencies and protect their slave owners. So he was trying to go around and trying to, say that what he believed this popular sovereignty would work, and Lincoln was saying, it's not going to work, especially in the light of the Supreme Court decision. And so the debate brought Lincoln to prominence because he actually had asked the question that needed to be asked. Basically, Lincoln knowing that the Supreme Court decision would not work in the light, and these states need to be considered totally free states and not bring slavery in the North, even with the decision that the Supreme Court had made. But Douglas still won the support in Illinois, and he was reelected to Senate, even though, as looking back at the debates, wasn't president then, but Lincoln actually won those debates. And Lincoln standing totally against the Dred Scott decision and totally against slavery. Yes, then in the meantime, we have the John Brown raid. So in October of 1859, this happened in Virginia. And this made further dissension between the North and the South. John Brown, remember him? He was responsible for the Pottawatomie Massacre in Kansas. So he went in and actually massacred some pro-slavery settlement and massacred some men. Well, now he was about, and he led 21 men into Harper's Ferry on the East Coast in Virginia. He's not in Kansas anymore. He's in Virginia. And he also went in and he seized the federal arsenal, where all of the arms, guns and ammunition were kept. And he took some of the citizens captive. So John Brown was saying, we're going to take over, the United States. We're going to start our own country, John Brown. So his scheme was to arm the slaves, give the slaves guns, and establish a republic in Virginia of his own, the John Brown Republic. I don't know what he would name it, but he wanted to establish a new republic that would be against slavery. But he was trying to do it in a violent way. And so he would then, after he got basically armed the slaves, he would invade the South and he'd free all slaves too. That was his idea, John Brown's idea. Well, but he was doing it violently. The state militia was sent to Harper's Ferry. So the governor of Virginia called out the state militia, said, man, we have an uprising going here. And Virginia, being a slave state. Well, the United States then Marines came in from Washington, D.C., and the head of the Marines that came in to basically come against this uprising was Robert E. Lee. We'll find him, right? General Robert E. Lee, which later on would lead the Confederate Army, right? He lived 1807 to 1870. And so Robert E. Lee came in. Of course, we have John Brown taking shelter, and this is the building here, the small brick building where he took shelter, and he had his men in there, but most of his men would be killed or wounded, and Robert Lee would put on a 2-day siege. Basically, 2 days. They'd be stuck in this little place for 2 days, and a siege until basically. Some of his men firing ended up being killed or wounded, and the state of Virginia then took John Brown captive and tried him for treason and conspiracy. And in the midst of all this, he was found guilty and he was hanged. Well, a lot of abolitionists, those against slavery, didn't like the idea that they end up hanging, John Brown, who basically was trying to stand against slavery in the only way he knew how. And then the South, of course, they wanted to get rid of every abolitionist, and emotions grew very fiery emotions between. In fact, the emotions grew worse on both sides. Also, the crisis would get worse with the literature that was going on. The citizens in the North were being aroused by the slavery issue, as in the North, Henry Ward Beecher. Here's a picture of him here. He lived 1813 to 1887. He was a very articulate preacher, and he had a very fiery message against slavery. He also wrote and printed his sermons abroad, which influenced thousands of people. So his sermons were written down and people were reading them, right? Also, this man, John Greenleaf Whittier, he wrote literature that aroused the sympathy for slaves too, and how slavery was so wrong. So we have, a preacher that printed his sermons, and we have a writer that sympathized. And we also would have, in 1857, Hinton Rowan Helper from North Carolina. And here's a picture of him down here. And he wrote The Impending Crisis of the South. What he wanted to do was to show how slavery was totally destroying the South, and trying to get Southerners to say, no, you don't want to stand up for slavery in any way, basically saying it's going to destroy the South. So these were three famous writers during this time that aroused the people, especially in the North, to not support slavery, and gave them sympathy towards slaves and to help those be released from slavery. Uncle Tom's Cabin. Okay, in 1852, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and she lived 1811 to 1896. She was Henry Beecher's sister, the preacher's sister. And so she published a book. She was a great writer, and she published this book called Uncle Tom's Cabin. And it told of dreadful abuses of slavery in the South. And the book was read everywhere. So basically, it was a story going on, a family novel type story. And everyone was reading it and interested in her writing and saw how terrible slavery was. And then they started making plays on Uncle Tom's Cabin, and these actors would travel over a great distance and put on their plays, and thousands of people would come to see the plays, and the plays were very much against slavery. People were aroused against slavery in the North by Uncle Tom's Cabin, the book, and the plays. So now would be the time. What do you think would happen? Of course, we look. The nation would be divided. The Civil War was about to occur.